retired parliamentary public programs manager for the Library of Parliament, and it was here that she had the opportunity to research more about the women who have worked in the civil service. And once you get a chance to read the pamphlet, you'll see just how much detail Diane has put into her presentation tonight. Tonight's talk will cover only the basics of what Diane has learned about the first women to work at Parliament. Retired now, Diane calls herself a part-time photographer and a part-time genealogist, although I find that last one hard to believe because every genealogist I've met is usually full-time genealogist. But tonight, for more importantly to us, she's our guest speaker, so will you please welcome Diane Bryden.
Thanks, Richard. I didn't put in there that I'm also a part-time curler, so I have a hard time fitting everything in. I'm really happy to be here with you tonight, and I'm very grateful to the Historical Society of Ottawa for inviting me to share the story of Emma Maud Lampman, and I'm just going to share my screen now. And Emma Maud was the first woman who was appointed to a permanent position in Parliament. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about her story and a bit about other women in her situation. I'm also grateful, as Richard said, that the Historical Society had interest in publishing Maud's story, and for providing me an angel editor in the person of Christine Jackson. She really made the words sing. And I think I gave her hives at some point, so we were working through it. And as Richard said, members will be receiving copies soon. I won't have time to tell you everything that's in the pamphlet. Today I'll focus on a little bit how I uncovered Maud's story, as well as the story of women working in the early civil service of Canada. So I first encountered Maud Lampman when I was gathering data for my master's thesis. Maud is one of the 3 women who had been appointed to work at Parliament by 1907. But she was no means the first woman appointed to the civil service. That would be Fanny Yielding, who was one of the 12 female clerks working in Indian Affairs in 1895. And there is Fanny. How did I figure out that she was the first person? The Secretary of State published the Civil Service List annually starting in 1886. It included every permanent employee at work over the 12 months before July 1st of any given year. It also shows the date of the employee's first appointment. A search of the Civil Service List from the beginning, the first time it was published, didn't list a woman working there until 1882. So here in the first edition, we find Fanny Yielding. You'll notice that her name was spelled incorrectly, as it was for many years afterwards. It is Yeilding. You can see in the middle column that she was appointed on April 3rd, 1882. And just to the right of that, you'll see that by this point in time, as a third-class clerk, she earned an annual salary of $600. I have no evidence that Fanny ever met Maud. It's possible, since they both worked in the civil service in the relatively small community that was then Ottawa. Many of the women working in the civil service in Canada, England, and the US before 1900 were well educated and from families headed by doctors, architects, clergymen, wealthy businessmen, and other professional men. When their families fell in hard times, these women needed to find a source of income, but they were caught between economic necessity and respectability. They couldn't maintain their social standing and go out and work in a factory, say. Well-bred women in Ottawa were lucky to have the federal civil service as an option. Maud Lampman's and Fanny Yielding's experiences offer us a glimpse into the lives of all those women in the early civil service. And now to Maud herself. While I was working at the Library of Parliament, the parliamentary librarian wondered who was the first woman to work there. So I went back to my thesis research, and looked. A search of the Civil Service List from the time it was first published did not list a woman working on Parliament Hill until 1903. There we find Mrs. Archibald Lampman. And I have to admit, when I was a young graduate student, I didn't recognize the name Archibald Lampman as the poet at the turn of the 20th century. So let's look more closely at the entry as we did for Fanny. Maud's first date of appointment, the 14th of January, 1903, is the same as the date of the current appointment. So this told me that this was her first permanent appointment to the civil service. We found her salary to be $800 per year. And I find it interesting that she's making more per year than Joseph Pigeon, who was appointed the same level near the same time, just listed below her. We find her birthday to be January 21st, 1871. So that would make her almost 32 years old when she was appointed on January 14th in 1903. So I want to ask any federal public servants, whether retired or not, watching, can you imagine this personal data being made public today? But there's so much more to the story behind those statistics. Over the next hour or so, I'll tell you about Maud's personal life leading up to her entry into the civil service, including her marriage to Archibald and some unpleasant things she had to bear, including a whiff of scandal. I'll tell you how she fell in hard times and her efforts to find a position in the civil service. I'll tell you about women's experience in the civil service, so you have some context for her situation. And then I'll tell you what I have learned about her own experience in the civil service, which becomes a case study of many women in her situation. Emma Maud descended from one of the early founding families of Toronto. Her great-great-great-grandfather, George Plater, fled New Jersey during the American Revolution and found himself in the town of York in 1790. There he amassed a good deal of property and became a prominent citizen. Skipping ahead a couple of generations, Emma Maud's father, Edward, studied medicine at the University of Toronto and became a successful doctor in the city. In 1860, Dr. Plater married Charlotte Arnold, and they had 4 daughters, and Emma Maud, as you can see there, was the second, born in 1867. Emma Maud grew up in a house on the western outskirts of the city, just about here on this bird's eye view of Toronto. It was really kind of in the countryside. Edward Plater was a forward thinker, believing in the benefit of fresh air and advocating for sanitary water supplies and proper ventilation. So he settled his family away from the dirt and pollution. He also came to be known as an expert in treatment for consumption and other respiratory ailments. While practicing as a doctor, Edward started the Sanitary Journal. The index to the first volume shows that topics were not limited to sanitary conditions in milk and water. You can find this journal online through Canadiana.ca or the Internet Library if you'd like to look up the article on diet versus whipping. But tragedy struck. Over 10 years, Emma Maud lost her mother and both of her younger sisters. Widowed with 2 young daughters, Edward Plater remarried in 1884. That same year, Edward moved the family to Ottawa. While practicing there as a doctor, he advocated for a federal health department to regulate matters such as sanitation, quarantine, and food adulteration. And I'll let you in on a secret, he wasn't successful at that early time. Edward had a house built in Sandy Hill, along the Radar River, away from the dirty and unsanitary conditions of Centertown. This house, called River Home in the city directories, was actually 2 semi-detached houses. In later years, the address is given as 381 and 383 Stewart Street. This house is no longer there. It was torn down years ago to build a high-rise condo. As you might know, Sandy Hill at this time was the home to much of Ottawa society, including businessmen, other professional men, and eventually the Prime Minister. Newspaper accounts tell us the Platers socialized with these folks and attended many of these society functions in Ottawa. Into their lives came Archibald Lampman, the son of an Anglican minister who had befriended Edward Plater. There is much to tell about Archibald, and many have written about him. I'm only going to include the parts of his story that involve or affect Maud. He joined the post office, and in 1885, when he met Maud, he made $550 a year. Archibald wrote over 250 letters and poems while at the post office, using post office letterhead. Much of what we know about his and Maud's life together, I pieced together through his letters to her or about her in letters he wrote to his friends. In 1885, when Maud met Archibald, she was 16 and he 24. She was said by the family to be a tall, blonde, blue-eyed beauty. He wooed her with poetry, writing a series of love sonnets. Letters between them are full of romance and the use of pet names, and the two appear to be smitten. 2 years passed, and the lovebirds announced their intention to marry, but Maud's father was against the union and limited their contact during the summer of 1887. But somehow Maud prevailed, and she and Archibald were married, with or without her father's blessing, at St. John's Anglican Church on September 3rd, 1887. And by the way, this church burned down around 1908. It stood where the Connaught building is now on Sussex Drive beside the Chateau Laurier. It was no society event. The newspaper reported on the interesting matrimonial event, saying the ceremony was quiet, only intimate friends being present. The bride was attired in a gray traveling dress. Soon after they married, Maud used a small legacy to publish Archibald's first book of poetry, titled Among the Millet. The dedication in the book is a sweet acknowledgement from the poet to his wife. During the first 3 years of their marriage, they lived in the semi-detached house beside her father on Stewart Street, possibly with reduced rent or rent-free. Archibald's father and mother lived with them, and at least 2 of his 3 younger sisters had moved in too. Then Maud and Archibald moved with his family to Queen Street. And finally, in 1892, they moved to their own place on Florence Street. No doubt Maud was happy to be on her own. In the early years, both traveled often and separately, Maud to visit friends and family in Toronto or Britannia, which was then reached by train from Ottawa, and Archibald with friends on canoe trips and to visit friends in Montreal and Boston. While apart, the two wrote to each other often and were lucky to have those letters. At one point, Maud expressed unhappiness. "They're all crazy for us to come and live in Toronto. Oh, how I wish I could. You must keep your eyes open for something here for my sake. It is so good to feel that they all like me here. I always feel as if I were almost in a different sphere. I feel just lost in Ottawa, except when I am with you, which you must remember is only a small portion of the time." In July 1891, Maud was thrown out of a carriage and badly hurt. Alarmingly, the accident with the carriage was potentially more dangerous than they imagined, for Maud was pregnant. Their daughter, Natalie Charlotte, was born only 6 months later. Archibald wrote in a letter that "my wife and my little daughter are doing exceptionally well. Maud is recovering most satisfactorily and has quite regained her strength." By 1893, Archibald, the 2 of them lived in Philemon Terrace at 369 Daly Street, and once again, Archibald's parents were living with them. Domestic trials ensued. Archibald wrote in a letter to a friend, "I shall have to postpone my visit. My little daughter is ill. My wife is abandoned by her servant." Adding to the stress, they weren't altogether comfortable with child rearing. He reported, "I have not the disposition necessary to make a good father and trainer of children, and my wife is too nervous. My little daughter is a wonderful little girl, but she's getting to be a very mischievous and perverse one, and she bullies her mother unmercifully." Left to visit his friends for several weeks in Boston. Upon returning, he wrote, "I found my wife and Natalie well enough, although they had both been sick while I was away, and my wife's servant had decamped. The servant question is about the same everywhere. I have been washing dishes the last few days." In October 1893, Archibald received a promotion with the related raise in pay, so life was a little easier. As you can see by the signature, at that time, all recommendations for promotion in the civil service went to the Governor General for approval. Even with the raise in pay, Archibald told his sister Belle in 1894 that he could not get ahead of his debts. He met frequently with fellow poets like Duncan Campbell Scott, seen here, and William Wilfred Campbell. Here is Archibald, and this is believed to be Maud. And if so, an interesting observation, this is the only photo I've located that includes the 2 of them, and even then, not on their own. This group of friends, along with Archibald's sisters, and there's some people believe that the other 3 women in the picture are his sisters, and Maud's sister, Kate Plater, they all socialized together. As an example, in 1890, they mounted a play in the Billingsbridge Hall as a fundraiser for the parsonage building fund of the local Trinity Church. They had connections in Billingsbridge. In 1894, Maud and Archibald welcomed a son, named Arnold Gesner after both their mother's maiden names. And I love how this birth announcement includes neither, it does not include either the name of the baby or the mother, which I think is interesting. Archibald wrote, "He's a dear little fellow, but when he's awake, he desires to have his meals continuously, and so gives his mother some little trouble. She's not very strong yet, but is improving slowly." Tragically, the baby died 3 months later from dysentery brought on by inadequate food storage in the summer heat. And this is so sad. Do you remember those articles in her father's sanitary journal about dangers in the milk can and foul water? Edward Plater was living just a few blocks away, and still it happened. The child was buried in Beechwood Cemetery. The tiny headstone bears his name. You can barely read Arnold carved on the top. His parents were devastated. Archibald wrote to a friend, "He was the most beautiful child I ever saw. He was strong and healthy for some weeks after he was born, but the natural supply of mother's milk gave out, and this unwholesome season was against him. For a whole week, we watched and tended and doctored the poor little fellow night and day, but the old accursed enemy beat us in the end." He continued, "My wife is exceedingly upset, not only in mind, but in health too. No doubt we shall both return to the normal condition in a short time, but just now we are very glad to have any comfort that is put in our way, and the kindly expressions of our friends have done so much." From a series of Archibald's letters, we learn about Maud's mental and physical health in the months following her baby's death. Said he, "I have moved into another house in the same row, a house with a kitchen, dining room, bathroom attached and a brick addition behind, a great convenience to my wife." 2 months later, he wrote, "My wife is in a very bad state of health, has had to take to bed several times since Christmas. I think she is improving, but too slowly." In the very next letter, he wrote, "My wife is bedridden for the present and cannot even sit up for more than a few minutes each day. Her illness is a very complicated one, and it will be necessary for her, among other things, to undergo an unpleasant, though not dangerous, surgical operation." 6 months later, she was still ill when he wrote, "My wife is in very miserable health, is continuously under medical treatment, and does not improve as rapidly as she should. My daughter grows daily more robust and is developing a very wild and unmanageable spirit. Says she to her mother the other day, 'Mother, you shouldn't speak when I am talking.'" So 1895 was a difficult year for both of them, and it was about to get worse. It wasn't money problems this time. In a June 1896 letter, Archibald wrote, "My father is ill, gradually succumbing to a cancerous disease, and I have taken him under my own charge to make things as endurable for him as possible." Archibald was still living on Daly Street, and his father, the Reverend, had moved into 383 Stewart, beside Maud's father, with Archibald's sister, Carolyn, and her husband, William LeBreton Ross. They were a tenant in the semi-detached home next door, as you can see from the Ottawa tax roll for that year. So it makes you wonder just who was nursing the father. Archibald Sr. died in 1897. Once Archibald Sr. passed on, the Lampmans moved to their own place at 187 Bay Street. From February to April 1898, Archibald wrote letters telling friends that he was in and out of bed with, quote, "chronic, serious organic heart trouble." In April, he reported, "The only remedy the doctors say is absolute rest, total inactivity, both physical and mental. As long as I attempt nothing active, I'm quite comfortable and have no pain whatever." Then he wrote, "Supposing by any possibility I could get away from here on a trip, is there anything I could do in your vicinity? Any place I could go where I should have your companionship?" Around this time, on June 21st, 1898, Maud's third child was born, little Archibald Otto. A month later, Father Archibald bade farewell to his wife, their newborn son, and his 6-year-old daughter on medical leave, and traveled to Halifax and Boston with friends paid for by his friends. While away, the two corresponded, he regaling her with his adventures, and she fretting about income, the heat of the summer, and probably worried the same malady would befall her newborn son as had her first son. He wrote back saying not to worry and to try and find someone to help. 3 months later, Archibald returned from his journey. He wrote back to his friend, I found my little family very glad to see me. My wife is fairly well, but she has had a rather hard summer. I must make it up to her another year. But he would not have the chance. On February 8th, 1899, Archibald died. Maud found herself arranging another funeral, and Archibald was buried beside his son in the family plot in Beechwood Cemetery. That's his tombstone on the left, little Arnold's on the right, and you can barely make out Lampman on the large stone behind. Tributes were published in newspapers across North America. And now it's time for the scandal. While all this had been going on, the birth of daughter Natalie, the birth and death of baby Arnold, Maud's lengthy illness, the death of Archibald's father, the birth of a second son, trips away from his wife and children, Archibald was carrying on with Catherine Waddell. Archibald met her as early as 1890. She was a fellow clerk in the post office. Scholars over the last century have disagreed on the exact nature of the relationship. It's clear she was well read and supportive of his poetry, and it's clear he wrote many poems with her in mind. There's a collection of Catherine Waddell's papers at Library and Archives Canada, found decades after her death. The collection includes a bound scrapbook into which Catherine Waddell pasted poems written by Archibald. The first page of the book has a pencil sketch of Catherine drawn by Archibald upon his return from that last trip in October 1898. On the facing page is an undated poem written in Archibald's hand, entitled A Portrait, where he describes Catherine in glowing prose. Lampman scholar Margaret Whitridge believed there was a love affair, and she published many of the poems from Kate's scrapbook in this book. Here are two of the poems. She makes all my blood and my spirit stir, whose lips are sweeter than my thoughts of her. And another titled True Passion, with the line, by nature's own decree, I love you. To situate you in time, 1895 was the year after baby Arnold died when his wife was so ill. In 1896, they were nursing his father in his wife's father's house. This dated poem from Catherine's book shows that Archibald was still writing poems to her in January 1899, only 10 days before he died. According to secondary accounts, Maud knew Catherine Waddell and about the relationship. In this letter, Archibald wrote to Maud in September 1897, and he suggests the two women meet up. This photo of the family was taken sometime in late 1898 or early 1899, around the time when Archibald died. On the back of the photo, Maud wrote to Miss Waddell from the family. So here's a puzzle. I found this photo in the Lampman family papers. Did Maud never send it to Catherine Waddell? Was it returned? It's a mystery. It seems Archibald's friend and fellow poet Duncan Campbell Scott knew Catherine Waddell, but only learned about the relationship years after. A friend of Scott's wrote, Scott considers that Lampman found his wife unsympathetic to poetry and thought in this girl he would find a spiritual mate. The idea of spiritual affinities was very important to Lampman. His wife was not such an affinity. So I guess things changed after Maud paid to publish Archibald's first book of poetry. But back to Maud. When Archibald died, she was a 32-year-old widow. She had two children to support, aged 7 and 7.5 months. Her father, whose house had been a refuge over the past decade, had moved back to Toronto in 1898. Within 2 weeks after Archibald's death, the Postmaster General sent a memorandum recommending payment of the usual gratuity of 2 months' salary to Mrs. Emma Maud Lampman, widow of the late Mr. Archibald Lampman. Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier approved it on March 2nd. So that $200 was a start, but what would she do in the future? Friends attempted to find her financial support. Scott and his colleagues solicited donations toward the publication of a book of Lampman's poetry for the sole support of his widow and children. They wanted to secure the widow the full and entire return without deduction of any kind. The undersigned are attending to this work solely as a tribute to the memory of a departed friend and an aid of his family. I found this copy of the solicitation in the Catherine Waddell papers at Library and Archives. It's unknown if she donated. 6 months later, Prime Minister Laurier also came to Maud's rescue. He signed a memo recommending the employment of Mrs. Lampman in the Privy Council office at special work for clerical and other assistants. On blackboarded stationery, Maud immediately wrote to thank him, saying, "The clerk has just furnished me with employment in connection with the records, which is to be performed at my house. Allow me to thank you for providing me with this temporary employment." About 2 months later, she wrote again to the Prime Minister saying, "Since you were so kind as to ask me to come to you if anything went wrong in connection with my work in the department, I venture to ask you to grant me an interview, if possible tomorrow, as it's now 3 weeks since my work was finished, and Mr. McGee, who was the clerk of the Privy Council at the time, gives me to understand there will be no regular supply of work, nor have I been paid for what I've done, so that I can make arrangements for my living expenses for the winter." From these letters, it's apparent that Laurier knew her, possibly from living in the neighborhood or from association with her husband or her father. It was very common to have the government of the day to reward, quote, friends, and it was an accepted practice. All appointments were made by the deputy minister. And deputies spoke openly about this patronage during testimony at a 1907 Royal Commission looking into the problems with the civil service. And I'm just going to let you read them. Even still, there were processes in place to attempt a semblance of appointment by merit, and Laurier or someone on his behalf told Maud to write the civil service examinations. Passing the civil service qualifying examinations was a requirement for permanent appointment. Applicants wrote the exams in the House of Commons chamber. The exams had been introduced in 1882 and remained exactly the same format for decades, and the government published the questions each year. So knowing this, it was easy to prepare for the exams, and there were several business schools in Ottawa which offered help to do so. Perhaps Maud turned to one of these businesses in the 1899 Ottawa City Directory. Maud wrote the 1899 qualifying exams at the earliest opportunity on November 15th, starting with this one at 10 o'clock, penmanship. From 10:30 to noon, English composition. At 1:30, arithmetic. And from 3:30 to 4:30, Canadian geography. As you can see, each exam was an hour and a half to 2 hours long, one after another. And they went on. The next day, Maud was back in the House of Commons chamber at 9:30 a.m. She started with history of England, France, and Canada, then English grammar from 10:30 to noon, orthography, no spell check in 1899, that was at 1:30, and transcription at 2:15, and a 6-minute typing test to be arranged at trade fairs. The makers had pretty girls with nimble fingers, typewriting. Marketing followed. People wanted the machines and the girls to go with them, and women flooded into clerical work. It was a game changer. When Maud wrote her exams, civil service clerks' duties were still focused on intellectual work and penmanship, but some skill at typewriting was required. But within a few years, the work, especially for women, would evolve into more recording and replicating, meaning that women without a formal education could be hired. Maud successfully passed both the preliminary and qualifying exams, and her name, along with the other successful candidates, was published in the Canada Gazette on the 23rd of December. But look closely, the names were listed alphabetically, not by the score they received, so as to allow deputy heads to find their names more easily. And for good measure, the names of successful candidates were published in the newspaper on page 2. And I think it's interesting that this list was deemed political, because today public servants take great strides to maintain impartiality. Where had Maud been living during all this time? We have some clues. A few months after Archibald's death, she summered at Billings Bridge, where her sister visited her in August. She wrote her letters to Laurier from 145 McLeod Street, and by November 1899, she had moved in with her mother-in-law, Susanna Gesner Lampman, at 528 King Street, now King Edward Avenue. Note that the newspaper item announcing that move also advised supporters the volume of her late husband's poems is shortly to be published. It has very many subscribers. By January 1900, the organizing committee had sold 1,200 of 1,500 advance copies. It was published 2 months later and advertised widely. The information on the flyleaf indicates the project organizers were as good as their word. Because Emma Maud Lampman registered the book herself, she would receive all royalties from the sales. Lampman was more successful after his death than during it, and demand for the book soared. Scott and his colleagues continued to sell subscriptions for subsequent editions of the book. This, what you see in front of you, is a solicitation from May 1900. And there were at least 4. The steady income, supplemented by book sales, allowed her to advertise for a reliable girl to help with the children while still living with her mother-in-law on King Street, although she soon moved out on her own to a house on Somerset Street West. The 1901 census shows Maud as the head of the household, supporting Natalie and Archie. A domestic named Ethel Gilbert, presumably a reliable girl, lived with them. Maud worked as a civil servant, and she earned $400 in the 12 months before March 31st, 1900. The Civil Service Act in effect in 1901 stipulated that temporary clerks, regardless of their work, were to receive an amount of not more than $400 a year. The Ottawa City Directory reported that she was a writer in the accounts branch of the Post Office Department, living in rooms on Victoria. She moved around a lot. And by the way, in 1901, Archibald's companion, Catherine Waddell, was still working in the Post Office Department as well. The rooms at 120 Victoria are gone now. They stood just about here at the corner of the Lion Street extension, across from where the Supreme Court is now, on what is now a parking lot beside the Library and Archives building. The photos on the right show the front and rear of the building. By 1902, Maud, still working in the post office, lived in Britannia for at least part of the year, an area she had visited many times during her marriage. The new electric railway had connected downtown Ottawa to Britannia in May 1900, and it meant she could commute to work. In this way, she followed her father's example of living outside the city. Perhaps she did this for her children, by then 10 and 4. But was she earning enough to support her family comfortably? We know from the census that Maud was earning $400 per year in 1901. How does that compare to other wages? A 1907 report based on the 1901 census defined particular classes of employment, including the professional class, which, as you can see, included government clerks. You can see the average wage for this category for both men and women. Women made just over a third of the money earned by men. The report also separated provincial and federal clerks in the right-hand side. As you can see, their average wage was considerably more than the overall professional class, and almost double in the case of women, $409 a year compared to $259. Clearly, work as government clerks was lucrative. And as for Maud, her stated income of $400 in the census in 1901 was just about the average for all female government clerks at $409. On December 13th, 1901, 2 years after passing her exams, Maud sent another letter to Laurier saying, "I'm anxious to be made a permanent servant in the post office, in the rank of a junior second-class clerk. I find it impossible to live and support 2 small children for whom I have to employ a nurse, upon the salary I am at present receiving, and with the restrictions of an extra clerk. It will be another year before her permanent appointment on January 14th, 1903. Other female temporary clerks were not so fortunate. At the 1907 Royal Commission investigating problems with the civil service, Thomas Boville, Deputy Minister of Finance, testified that some women had worked as temporaries in his department for 20 or 30 years, earning the same as those who had entered within the last 3 or 4 years. Other deputy ministers at the Royal Commission explained the advantages of employing temporaries, which in 1907 was estimated to be over 700 people. They could be employed just when work demanded it. They could be kept on indefinitely at the same rate of pay and with no extra benefits. And as they were not included in the civil service list as permanent employees, the deputy ministers maintained an appearance of economy. Furthermore, the deputies stated that they engaged mostly women as temporary employees because men would not accept the low wages that came with the related insecurity, and women would not usurp permanent positions that otherwise could be awarded to men. At this time in Canada's history, there was great upheaval due to high levels of immigration and migration, which led to the country's population exploding and expansion into the West with an increase in industrial activity. The civil service expanded quickly to manage it. At the turn of the century, the inside service was defined as the officers, clerks, and employees of the several departmental staffs in Ottawa versus those in the regions. Each department had a chief clerk and first, second, and third class clerks and messengers, and the third class was described as assigned the routine work of the department, comprising 4/5 of the whole work to be done. By 1907, there were many problems with the civil service, and the Royal Commission I mentioned earlier was struck to make recommendations on several issues. Problems with classification, where clerks at different levels performed the same duties and received unequal wages. Problems with antiquated hiring practices that did not meet the requirements of the day. Problems with temporary employees, as we've seen, remaining in place for up to 20 years with no increase in salary nor superannuation. The problem with enticing good candidates to the service when the exploding economy offered up opportunities elsewhere, and the problem with women. There were too many of them. I mentioned before how office work had changed from more intellectual work, mostly due to the introduction of a typewriter. The number of women flooding into the civil service had the deputy ministers very concerned. Deputy ministers appearing before the Royal Commission expressed their opinion about women working there. This was Joseph Pope, Under Secretary of State, and I'll let you read it. William Lyon Mackenzie King, then Deputy Minister of Labor, said this. Eugene Fizet, Deputy Minister of Militia and Defense. John Fraser, Auditor General. Robert Coulter, Deputy Postmaster General and the largest employer of women. Frank Pedley, Deputy Superintendent General of Indian Affairs. And my favorite, John Courtney, Chair of the Royal Commission. So it's clear that there was a difference of opinion about the extent of the problem women created. In my thesis, I created a profile of women working in the civil service to put the deputy minister's concerns in perspective. I used the civil service list to gather the information. On this index page from 1907, on the left, for example, you can see Maud Lampman, she's in the one in the box, and the stars mark the 3 other women on this page. Everybody else was men. I then went to the various departments inside the volume and collected each woman's specific details. So in the case on the right, I found Maud, and I also collected information about Bernice Chevrier and Miss Patterson, 2 women who had joined Maud in the Library of Parliament over the previous 4 years. I did this for 1895, 1900, and 1907, the same year as the Royal Commission, to compare over time. And then for each year, I counted the total number of employees. So here you see the number of male and female employees among departments at the turn of the century in 1900, just before Maud's appointment. The black at the top of each bar shows the number of women. The post office had the highest number of clerks, as well as the highest proportion of female clerks. 8 of the departments did not at this point in time employ women, including the Senate, the House of Commons, and the Library of Parliament. On the right, you can see the numbers of men and women working in the civil service overall. About 9% of all clerks in 1900 were women. By 1907, the same year as the Royal Commission, the number of clerks overall had increased. Just about every department at that point had appointed women to permanent positions, except for the Senate, the House of Commons, and Public Works. Take a look at the numbers on the right. You'll see that the proportion of women clerks had jumped to 24%. And then remember that there were an estimated 700 people working as temporaries that same year, mostly women, who were not included in those numbers. Next, I looked up each woman in the Ottawa City Directory. Their residential information indicates their level of responsibility for supporting a family. So let's add up the women who were recorded in 1900 as the heads of households, with the women who were living at home with no male household head, where there was often a widowed, unworking mother. These would be women who would be partially responsible for supporting a household. And that tells us that about 43%, or a little less than half the women working, were partially responsible for supporting a family. By 1907, the proportion of women supporting a household had decreased to a little more than 1/4. Maud was among these. Instead, more women, almost 40%, were by 1907 independent and boarding or living with others, or in apartments on their own. Almost always the city directory indicated that the women were single, married, or widowed, like Maud, and in most cases they were listed by their husbands' names. The largest number of female clerks were single, although there was a slight increase in the proportionate number of married and widowed women as time went on. The number of married women remained small because, in the belief that married women had adequate support, they were not hired. And there was an understanding that once women married, they would not require an income and they were expected to leave the service. Using the salary information in the civil service list, I added up the salaries each woman received and calculated the average. In 1900, all third-class clerks then on the payroll were moved to a newly created classification called junior second-class clerk. Many women were among them, and you can see the big jump in numbers from 1900 to 1907. Maud must have heard about it, for it's to this level she asked to be appointed in her letter to Laurier in 1903. So now we're back at the point where we started, and we have a better understanding of women's work in the civil service. In 1903, when Maud was permanently appointed to the Library of Parliament, she was the only woman among 7 clerks total. She entered at the relatively new level of junior second-class clerk, and lucky for her, the minimum salary that year was raised from $600 to $800. One interesting fact, note that her birth year in the second to last column is listed as 1871. All other records up to the point, and I pointed out the birth date of her earlier, when she entered the civil service, indicate her birth year was 1867, which in 1903 would have made her 36 years old. It's likely she was worried about the upper age restriction of 35 years of age for appointment, and not knowing how long it would take to be appointed, she gave a later birth year upon applying in 1899 when she was already 32. This was a common practice. Fanny Yielding did the same thing. Maud's salary increased by $50 per year, an increase also set out in the Civil Service Act. The bottom chart shows an estimation of the cost to support a family of 5 per year in 1907. You can see that Maud's salary that year was a little behind the estimated living costs that a family would require for the year. And in case you're wondering, here's what Fanny Yielding, the first woman to be appointed to the civil service, earned during the same years. Yes, she was still at work. By 1909, Maud had caught up to her, despite Fanny working in the civil service 23 years longer. What might have been Maud's and Fanny's working situation? Most departments reported to the 1907 Royal Commission that staff worked from 9 or 9:30 to 4 or 4:30, with up to an hour and a half for lunch. There are suggestions that the work week was Monday to Saturday. Clerks were entitled to 3 weeks of holidays. And specifically to Maud, the annual report for the library in 1907 says that the collection had outgrown the available space, with staff stumbling over boxes piled in the hallways. This photo shows that they were full to bursting. The library's annual reports describe the various books, maps, and materials they acquired each year. At this point in time, the Library of Parliament was also the National Library of Canada. The probate record for Maud's will lists her occupation as a bookkeeper, so it's possible she was involved with purchasing some of the items listed here. Once joining the library permanently, Maud moved for at least part of the year to Buena Vista Road and Rockcliffe Park. It was described as a residential pleasure resort at the terminus of the Ottawa Electric Railway, which had connected Rockcliffe to downtown as early as 1900. So in short, she moved from the western extent of Ottawa's electric railway in Britannia to the eastern end in Rockcliffe. The red line on this 1879 map of Rockcliffe marks Buena Vista Road, on which was built Maud's new house announced in the newspaper in 1904. Maud lived on Buena Vista Road for 5 years, possibly near the terminus of the electric railway at the intersection of Lisgar Road and Buena Vista, on which she might have traveled to work. Rockcliffe Park was a pleasant enclave at the time, but not yet the wealthy neighborhood we know today. There were only a few people living in a few cottages. This is the entire list of residents from the 1909 directory. Over the years Maud lived there, her neighbors included civil servants, office clerks, dressmakers, managers, civil engineers, grocers, merchants, accountants, tradesmen, and a gardener. She lived in town during the winter and moved to Rockcliffe in the summer. At least one of those winters, she stayed in an apartment at 340 Cooper. Earlier that summer, perhaps looking for additional income, she advertised her Rockcliffe house for rent, listing a telephone, a piano, and spring water in the house as assets. And this is perhaps one reason why she needed extra funds to help with the expense of both Natalie and Archie attending school away from Ottawa. Note the lower news clip is inaccurate. Archie was at Lakefield College School, not Lakewood. A year later, Maud moved from Rockcliffe, buying this house on Lisgar Street West in Centertown. And so by 1910, she was living a comfortable life. She'd bought her second house, and she took part in Ottawa's social life. The newspapers tell us that Maud attended a dance at the Hotel Victoria in 1910, along with daughter Natalie and a young man whom Natalie would eventually marry. A few months later, on November 17th, Maud poured tea and coffee at a delightful tea held in honor of a visitor from England. Only 5 days later, on November 22nd, 1910, she was found dead at her desk in the library. She was just shy of her 44th birthday. 3 doctors who were serving as MPs rushed in from the chamber, but could not revive her. The coroner determined she died instantly, with the cause regarded as heart failure. Both Ottawa newspapers reported the story, appearing on the front page in the Evening Journal on the left. Maud was buried in the Lampman family plot at Beechwood Cemetery. Unlike Archibald and little Arnold, there's no headstone to mark her life. And once again, her children, Natalie, aged 18, and Archie, aged 12, suffered through the early death of a parent. Maud's funeral was held 3 days later in Christchurch Cathedral, attended by a great number of friends and relatives. The list of those presenting floral offerings was extensive, including family, her friends, Archibald's friends, the staff of the Library of Parliament, and Archibald's muse, Catherine Waddell. I find it interesting that Maud's son, Archie Lampman, is listed among the chief mourners, and you can see him there on the right-hand side in the second line listed. But Natalie is not listed anywhere in this news article. Maud appointed brother-in-law William LeBreton Ross and her older sister, Catherine Plater, as guardians for her children, and instructed them to set up a trust out of her estate. There was income from an insurance policy and the Civil Service Retirement Fund gratuity. Once the $200 death gratuity from the government was added, income from the estate, approximately $3,000, was the equivalent of 3 times Maud's annual salary. So once again, the Lampman children were financially vulnerable. The next year, the 1911 census recorded Natalie, then age 19, as head of the household, and Archie, now 12, living at home. Aunt Catherine Plater, Maud's sister, lived with them working as a civil servant. She was reportedly living in New York City when Maud died and returned to assist with her orphaned niece and nephew. It was 6 months before Aunt Catherine secured temporary work in the civil service, marked there with an asterisk, and another 4 months before she was made permanent in the post office in October. Her salary was only $500, less than half of what Maud earned in 1910. Upon Maud's death, one of Archibald's friends immediately wrote to the Prime Minister urging him to give the children a year's salary. And there were entreaties in the Ottawa papers to give Natalie, by then 18, a government job. 6 months later, Natalie did acquire a clerk position, appointed as a temporary in June 1911, and then permanently in October, less than a year after her mother's death. Her $600 starting salary was $200 less than her mother had received upon her appointment 12 years earlier. So together, Natalie and Aunt Catherine Plater earned almost as much as Maud, but it took the two of them. 4 years later, Natalie married Loftus McGuinness, son of a prominent poet from British Columbia. That's somehow a fitting end to the story. The daughter of a poet married to the son of another. Archie lived with his sister after her marriage, served in the First World War, became a reporter, and died of suicide by poisoning in 1938, aged 39. Natalie died childless in 1971. So in conclusion, Maud was born into a comfortable life, and though she fell on hard times, her status, her connections, and her education allowed her to secure a position in the civil service. This allowed her to continue to live in the manner to which she was accustomed. It's both a fortunate and disappointing fact that we know a lot about Maud's early years because of the status of her father, and that we know about Maud's later life because of the status of her husband. Fortunate, because since they were well known, there are plenty of primary and secondary sources about them. And because of their fame or status, people kept their diaries, letters, and photographs. And it's disappointing because she probably could not have left such a record of life on her own. So I'd like to thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you so much, Diane. I have to say that, speaking on behalf of the HSO, you've blown us away with your presentation tonight. It's so thoroughly researched and magnificently presented. You've set a bar that I don't know whether we can match as going forward. I'd like to also mention that we are very thrilled that the very week that we are releasing the pamphlet with Maud Lampman's story, that here you are giving us our presentation. And just a bit of background on that for everybody. Our Historical Society of Ottawa, originally the Women's Canadian Historical Society, we've been around for 124 years. And our first monthly meeting, I believe it was November or December of 1898. And what our members did was they gathered together to listen to a speaker, which is what we do today. But in those days, what the speaker had to do was write a paper, and then they would speak to their paper at the presentation, and then the paper would be made available for distribution. So we've really come full circle right now with having our speaker and our pamphlet. And again, we're doing the same thing next month with Robert's presentation on the Laroque store. So it's very thrilling that we can circle back to history that way. So first of all, I'll again invite anybody who has questions, please to type them into the chat box, and so we'll see if we can get through them all tonight. So here's one question. Did her husband, Archibald, ever cross paths with another poet and postal office employee, Charles Sangster?
I can't tell you that. I only researched Archibald insofar as he was able to provide information about Maud. I don't claim to be an expert on Archibald Lampman. There are lots of other scholars that know him much better than I.
The story you told tonight is a tragic story. we heard about lost children. We heard about husband dying early. We heard about Maud dying early. We heard about her son ending his life tragically later on. Any evidence of mental illness in the family?
Yeah, somebody else mentioned that. I haven't come across any documentation about it. It's hard to know what the illness was that she suffered from. It might have been postpartum depression after losing a child. In the case of Archie, he went to war and he served in France and presumably saw some horrors in the First World War. He committed suicide in 1939, just before the Second World War. And I'm wondering whether there was any connection there, but I don't know anything further. It's only his death record told me how he died. I don't know any more about that.
I think we are all intrigued with the level of research that you did for this, Diane. One person is asking, are the civil servants lists available online? What years do they cover?
They are all online. You have to look in a few places. The best place is in the Internet Archive. They don't have all the years, but they're easier to consult there. They have a flip page format. They have them on Canadiana.ca. They have some years there as well, and in Library and Archives Canada as well. So between the three, you have to kind of move around, but there is coverage. They do start, as I said, in 1886 is the first year it was published, but for the 1885 year. And the last year they were published is 1918. And I'll tell you, for those that on the line that might be interested in the House of Commons and the Senate, the first woman in the House of Commons was in 1917. Her name was Marietta Hartley. And in the Senate, I don't know. They didn't hire anybody permanently before they ended the civil service list in 1918. However, in 1907, there were depositions about the women who were cleaning in the Senate, and they made $1 a day.
I was going to ask you about that because you mentioned Maud having a servant, and that wasn't too unusual back then. And you broke down the budget. One would have to wonder what a servant made in those days.
I can't remember whether Ethel Gilbert wrote down her salary there or not. I have to go back and look. I'm sure if you found, there's lots of servants in the 1901 and 1911 census, and they would probably list their salary.
Here's a question that related to what we spoke about before. Do you know the cause of death for Maud?
They said heart failure, and there were other newspaper articles that said that she was recovering from illnesses. In her obituary, it said that she had suffered from this illness for a long time. So I have to believe that there was some weakness there, heart issue there.
Someone has asked if you have information about the Lampman's cottage.
In Rockcliffe? That one? Probably.
No, no. They have the Lampmans had a cottage where the Rideau Canal is now, on the bank opposite Carleton University.
Oh yes, yes. It wasn't theirs though. They just rented it. That was one of the near the Lockmaster's cottage. Yes.
There was a cottage there, and it's on Lampman Crescent. To go into it, it's on Lampman Crescent. Mm-hmm. It's quite an interesting place. It's got a lot of steelworks from the owners of that environment at that time.
They rented a lot of cottages. They rented up in Gatineau. They rented in Britannia. They rented in Billings Bridge. They rented. They escaped the city. And I actually think, if you read the newspapers, a lot of people did. And I think they didn't have air conditioning. It was a way of getting out of the city.
Yeah, I know where a picture of it is, actually. So if you're ever interested.
So I have two questions. Thank you, Brian. I have two questions that are connected. Well, one person's asking what initially made you choose Maud for your thesis, and the second question, was she difficult to research, and what was the most challenging part?
What made me choose it? You know, I've been trying to figure that out. It was a long time ago. I did the initial research in 1980, and that was the years. There were no computers then, no internet, and my brother and I went into the archives I would come home from Queens and sit Saturday and Sunday with him, pouring through all the civil servants lists and writing out the names and their salaries and the whole thing. I wish my thesis supervisor was online because he would be able to tell me how we got there. I think I was really looking at women and working and the civil service. I can't remember. I wish I could. And was she difficult to research? I have to say no, because when Sonia, the parliamentary librarian, said to me, "Does anybody know who the first woman was?" and I went and looked up her name, and then I recognized Archibald Lampman. I was a little more mature then, and I said, "Well, there must be something about her if he's famous." And I started to look, and it's like everything blew up. And when I found out her father, he was famous, and I was able to find those sources. And then once you just start gathering up tidbits, you know, you get newspaper records, you get found the letters. Sandra Gwynn, who wrote The Private Capital, there's a whole chapter on the wives of the poets. Duncan Cameron Scott's wife and Maud. She kind of dismisses Maud as a bubblehead. I think maybe in the early years she might have been. I think she might have been spoiled and brought up in a family where she was indulged. But no woman at the age of 32 with 2 children to support is a bubblehead. I mean, she's got to be able to gather her resources. And through the 90s, when they were having problems with money, Maud was desperately trying to balance the money, and Archie would go traveling and send her money back, and she'd sort of beg him, "Can I get some money?" And he'd say, "Well, I'll stop next week and send you $50." You know, so no, I think she probably had to kind of hold it together.
In Gwyn's book, she also suggests, my recollection, that Lampman and Scott's relationship was extremely close.
They were good friends, yes.
Yeah, yeah. So I have another question here. I'm sorry. You had mentioned Natalie's father-in-law. Was that Tom McInnes?
Yes.
Okay.
In British Columbia, yes.
Yeah. And the booklet that we've been talking about, somebody's asked about that. That, of course, is the HSO pamphlet.
Yeah, I'm going to just put it up on the screen for you.
Okay, sure.
When I get back to it that far.
That will be available on our website very soon, probably within the next week or two. It's going to be distributed to our members first. And our members, as Richard mentioned, get all of our pamphlets free of charge. And then it'll be available on our website. And for those who would like, actually, I'm not sure how soon, I'm sorry, I'm mistaken about the web. You can buy it through our website, that's true. The purchase information will be on our website. You can contact us to order your own copy. And again, when we hopefully resume our speaker series in the auditorium next September, we'll have copies of all of our pamphlets available for folks who are interested in them as well.
I have to say, I love that picture.
That is a wonderful picture. If I'd seen that picture, we would have used it on our posters instead of a picture of the event. Somebody's made a comment here, which is kind of interesting. After the First World War, May 1919, my grandmother, a clerk in the civil service, married my grandfather in secret. If their marriage had been known, she would have had to quit her job.
Yeah,
her grandfather was recovering from being gassed in World War I, so was still getting organized. So that was obviously a big help to that household.
I think there was probably a lot of that.
I have to admit that when you're talking the civil service exam, I had to look up to see what orthography meant. So
yeah, spelling test.
They just called it spelling. I would have understood pretty quickly.
Yeah.
I also wonder, given the time frame of Archibald Lampman and writing letters referring to his mistress and meeting the mistress, and then Archibald Lampman's death, I wonder if anybody investigated whether there were suspicious circumstances in his demise. Perhaps one couldn't have blamed Maud.
It's really a mystery to me, because it's clear that she knew her, but the children refused to let anybody publish the information about her until the 1940s. So clearly there was something going on there, but I don't know enough, and I didn't know enough to really go into it in detail. I don't really include anything about that in the book. I don't really know how the family felt, although there's some indications that they finally gave permission in 1949 to that book to include reference to them, their affair. So I don't know. It's weird how she knew her.
So
There's
somebody's
a little
pointed,
bit more about that in the booklet, actually. I do
Yeah.
talk a little bit more.
yeah, somebody's pointed out that Wikipedia says Archibald died of rheumatic heart disease. Another
Oh,
question.
that is what it was on his on the
Yeah.
death records. Yes, yeah, they both died of heart disease.
Somebody has also asked, do you know what happened to Kate later in life?
The mistress, I guess. Yes, she never married. She moved back in with her mother, and I think she died in the 1940s. And the booklet, the scrapbook that I mentioned, her nephew found when going through her things, and he was the one that donated it to the archives. And there's another one as well that is at the Robarts Library at the U of T, also full of Archie's poems to her. So somehow they kind of got scattered, as things often do when don't get kept together. But there were a lot of poems. He wrote a lot of poems, either about her, for her, or for her to read, that she kept. She actually, there's a I can't remember. There's a church in Vanier, I think it's St. Margaret's Church, where after his death, Catherine Waddell, actually put a plaque up to his memory on that church that she attended. So that's kind of interesting.
You know, you mentioned that the presentation is about Maud Lampman, because Archibald Lampman, of course, is quite famous. When my family lived in Barrie, the nearby school was named after Archibald Lampman. That's the first time I ever came across the name. We have somebody else who's pointed out that they were staying at a B&B in Gananoque, and they had a drawing of Archibald Lampman and some connection there.
There's a town in Saskatchewan named Lampman after him.
Yeah, quite a national figure. Somebody else questions, were those poems to Kate all published?
None of them were published in his lifetime, but the book I showed you, they were published in the 80s, I think, 70s or 80s, I can't remember the year, and by this Lampman scholar who was quite taken by the affair and the romance of it and the poems, and she put them together and she published it. And there are copies of that book in the library. You can get them in the library.
Well, Diane, I think that's all the questions that folks have had for you so far. If they have other questions, we welcome to contact the Historical Society, and we'll certainly pass them on to you. And also lots of great comments here about how much everybody enjoyed the presentation. I'd say we all really did enjoy the presentation tonight, Diane. And we thank you very much. And we look forward to having our own copy of the pamphlet so that we can enjoy the story even further. As you mentioned, there's greater detail in the pamphlet on some items. And I thank you so much for joining us tonight and doing this for us.
You're welcome. Thanks for giving me an opportunity to talk about Maud.
Excellent. So I'd like to remind everybody that the pamphlet, you'll be able to order it on our website fairly shortly. If you're not a member, if you are a member, you're going to be getting a complimentary copy. And as of September, we will be back in the auditorium at the Ottawa Public Library, hopefully. And as Richard mentioned, we have a table up front where we make our pamphlets available for sale. I'd like to say that our next presentation is a month from now. It's going to be featuring Robert Weinberger as our guest speaker. And this is the first time we'll have a guest speaker who's actually speaking to us from another province, because Robert lives in Winnipeg now. But his family was responsible for the last few decades of the Larocque's department store, which is such an interesting story. Larocque's was one of the major department stores on Rideau Street, but what made Larocque's unique is that they catered to Ottawa's Francophone population. And they had a French-speaking staff, and they were able to serve the customers in French. And the really neat thing, that's the way Larocque had set up the business. But Mr. Larocque faced bankruptcy in the 1920s, I believe it was, and the Weinberg family came in, they took it over, and instead of changing the whole format, they continued it as a French-Canadian staffed store serving French Canadians in the French language, even though they were a Jewish family from Montreal. So Robert will be here to tell that story. He has great memories. As Richard mentioned, his grandfather had started up the store, but it was his father and his uncle that ran the store. So as a child, he would go into the store, and this was just part of the family business. And certainly, I'm sure Robert was pretty convinced that when he grew up, he'd be running the store too. But the great department stores that Ottawa had, and you could probably list them off, all the Freemans and the Ogilvies, and they did not survive past a certain point. the national brand stores came in, things shifted to the suburbs. But that's all part of the story that Robert's going to tell us when he's with us in a month. And as Richard mentioned, in May, we're going to be having our final virtual speaker series presentation, and that'll be featuring Grant Vogel, talking about the paintings of the Bytown Museum and the stories that they tell. Again, thank you so much, Diane, and thank you for everybody for joining us tonight.